welcome back. We were in an exhibition today. It was very nice, and we had discussions about how we can deal with education and the objects in the exhibition and what does it mean for critical education. Now, in this ecm discourse, we will follow these questions and think about the intervenings of exhibitions, of curatorial strategies, of coming together in the work on political and society themes. And welcome again. This is the number 59 of our ecm discourse. And welcome, Matilde. We are really, really happy to have you here. And we are very looking forward to your presentation and to your talk. It has this wonderful title, Talkie, Pong, Walkie, Ping. And it takes place in our ecm discourse in a moment, in a weekend, in the framework, on a moment in the framework where we are talking about or discussing about the different approaches and practices of education at the intersection of art, education, and public relations. So the main questions I think you are dealing and we are reflecting on are the questions: what are the possibilities for spaces of agencies to transform knowledge production and to enable new forms of collaborations inside and outside of the institution. I can say before we had talks about what does it mean to be an art educator, what does it mean to bring radical approaches to an institution, and what does it mean to work with a community or to bring the institution to the public or to the urban space. I think that's the things you are very interested, and that's the topics you have many, many experiences. And we want to organize this Zoom sitting in this way that you give us an insight to your approaches and experience, maybe for 1 hour. And afterwards, we are very, very happy when we come into a discussion to reflect all the things we hear or to go in deeper topics. I want to say small words to you, to introduce you in this group, which is online. You are from Porto, so now we have a connection between Porto and Vienna, what is very, very nice. And we said before, all of us want to be in Porto now, maybe not in Vienna, because it's very cold here. So you are from Porto, and I think your main perspective comes from architecture, from the thinking about how does architecture planning society or organizing society. You are graduate on the Faculty of Architecture of University of Porto. And then you also, as a co-editor, founded a fanzine on architecture, which is called Friendly Fire, which I think is a very nice name for a magazine. 2010, you founded talkie-walkie. You will tell us about this project. And talkie-walkie has the aim to connect people. So we're in the topic of connections. How can we build up networks, architecture, and art in this special moment? And now you are head of education in the Galeria Municipal de Porto. So we come from the work outside of an institution to the work inside the institution with your biography. And you are responsible for the educational project called Ping, the walkie Ping, the talkie Pong, as well of the public program of the Galeria Municipal de Porto, where you have different formats to bring institution and public together. So maybe I stop here and you start your presentation and your talk. And thank you again that you are here with us. And thank you to all for questions, thinking with us and talking about the field of art education in this ECM discourse.
Thank you all for this invitation and to be present in this session. We were right now deciding how we can also do a break in this sequence of image that I will show. So I don't have too much statements or written contents. So we'll do a pause in the middle to see if anyone wants to wave their arms and ask for questions. For me, it's nice how things are so much closer than I always normally think. Is that I know someone from your expanded team that it's Nora. I met it in some lectures in Schravs and also at the Fine Arts School of Porto, and she was also orientating the PhD of a colleague. So somehow we are much more closer than sometimes we think. And last time we saw each other was in a very nice moment in the north of the country, in Douro, in an international meeting organized with a research group of the Fine Arts School on mediation and education. I felt that we had a lot in common on that place, and it was really nice to see how very easily we can have this kind of affection or intellectual pleasure from people we thought we didn't know before. Last time, so I met Renate and Simon, that it's also here. I did a presentation that was something like this, so a big rhizome of what I was coming from and what I was planning to do and what I had at the moment in my hands to work with. And when Renate invited me to talk about a little bit what I presented and to a different public that are the ECM students and followers, I thought that would be very difficult when we do a PowerPoint. Normally we do a sequence of images. So I lost somehow this cosmo and constellation of ideas to prepare something that was in a timeline. So I'll do my best just to explain my career, all my work I did till arrive here today. And sometimes maybe by mistake I will say me, myself and I, but of course I've been always working in a team, so maybe I will change right now for a group of people that I always work. So I studied architecture in a very beautiful building in Porto, famous for the methodology taught in that school, where the drawing and the surveys and the measuring and walking was very important as approach to think on a project. And since and during 6 years of studies, we are not more than to be prepared to be a very good employee as an architect in an architecture office. So we work a lot, but we work to become an architect in an office. So the opportunities to do or to experiment other things, it's not so easy in the architecture school of Porto. And to give you an idea, the school of Porto is famous as an approach or a methodology to teach architecture. And I never heard about a single woman name as an architect. And during 6 years and maybe even some years after, I took time to understand all some misogyny that existed in the faculty of architecture. Although some of these architects here were my teachers, and they were important, and they became also very important in the architecture of contemporary architecture in the world. This one here is Álvaro Siza. It's the Pritzker Prize of Architecture in the city of Porto, and is although someone that I'm still very connected in terms of how we think, how he draws, how he talks. And parallel to this group of men teaching architecture, it's also important to mention that they were anti-fascists. They were against the colonial war during 64 to 74. They are still important in terms of political activism, but this is a very representative picture of the School of Porto in the 70s till nowadays. So it's a 6 year studies where we draw a lot, and we have this kind of classical studies of to draw, and we also do a lot of from ink drawings to AutoCAD. So when I open an office of architecture, I saw myself surrounded by this kind of very boring drawings and details, construction plans and sections. So I always living in a paradox that I wanted more to become an architect more attentive to the world, to the land, to the site that was surrounding me, and we were sharing an office, an architecture office, and we were 5 colleagues doing each other their own project and also doing competitions, and we were always feeling that there was a lack of a battlefield in the architecture group of people. People were not criticizing what was happening in the city, or even between offices of architecture or rights of young architects. So we create a fanzine called Friendly Fire, where we were motivating and open a field to discussion, where people could bring contributions to the fanzine. And what we were only defining is that we were writing everything and doing the draws, everything in AutoCAD. That it's our software program that we use. So we were not doing as designers and graphic designers, we were using the same tools of architecture. So for example, this font you see here is the default font of an AutoCAD software. And the skull you see, you might recognize that it's Le Corbusier. So we became like the icon of our collective. We were doing these kind of fanzines and doing some book launch where we could do. and drawing in AutoCAD, writing about things that we were doing, like picnics on places a little bit bizarre and odd, but places where we could discuss what was happening around us. And then one day we were invited to be part of the Triennial of Lisbon, to create a big like spacecraft machine where we could invite people to do their own fanzine. So there was a table in the middle with a photocopy machine and some texts and contents and images, and people were doing like collage and cutting and pasting and put everything together and creating leaflets of to then compose a big fanzine. So we call it like the biggest fanzine in the world, with all the participation of people. And from that moment, we start to understand that sometimes that happens, is that the most underground you are, the most institutionalized sometimes you become. So we were always wanted to be a garage office of architecture, an underground place to do fanzines and to talk about and discuss architecture. But then we were represented in this international triennial of architecture. I would like just for show you some different images that are important to me, and most of them comes from the cartography and maps and mental maps and psychogeography, and there's different moments and movements and artists we can bring to these kind of references, but I always been very inspired by the way we explain someone how to go to one place in a direction to find another place. And that kind of exercise of creating mental maps came with an important person in my life. She's called Elvira Leite, and she created with one woman from the education and one sculpture artist from land art. They explore this process, how to draw and to describe to another person how to reach my house, or to go from the school to house back. And I was always very interested on the way we represent and we cartograph things, because when we also do mapping, we are also deciding and selecting what we want to show and what we want to bring as an evidence. So that is something that moves me a lot, and I'm always interested in how to see how kids, for example, draw a map, think about it. But this is a collection of image, as I said, so it's pictures that I'm taking from things that I do as an experimentation, or that I pass and I take pictures. So it's a little bit to show you what moves me or what makes me stop. We had the office in a very nice social housing complex in the city center, and all these corners, gaps, in between spaces from the outside to the inside of the houses, or all these steps and platforms were a very nice place to set this kind of scenes that I'm showing in this image of kids playing around. So I was always very interesting to see how people occupy mainly these kind of frontiers between the interior and the exterior, the private and the public space, And these transitions place were always very important to me, or this kind of organization that kids do at home, like this. And so this is also this kind of things that I take pictures, how people collect, organize, show what they collect, how the still life be collected and become rotten, from life to rotten. So these kind of things are sometimes things that I do to myself, or because I'm doing a workshop with someone, or a drawing school, in this case with someone I like to work a lot, Karen Lacroix. So this kind of process to look, of course, that are practices and methodology that we see in artists. But I'm also very curious about this kind of strange and uncanny objects, like this crystal museum in the north of the country. Now, from this series of images that I brought to show a little bit how I work and I look to the world, I will talk how somehow I skipped the architecture practice and the office to go into a project with a partner, Anna. The two of us together, we created that company agency called talkie-walkie. And talkie-walkie was the name chosen because this idea of walking and talking and discussion and the guided tours and to look and to share. So we create this company. We start to do organize travels to and trips to architects. Although every time they were coming to Portugal and Spain, they were asking for different trips and things to see, because they were coming with their schools or their group of architects, so they wanted to somehow us to program a specialized travel. We worked a lot like this. We created a team, but again, we were more happy doing more than just bringing architects talking to architects in these kind of travels. But we start to question more about what we were doing, and me and Anna, we organized and defined a little bit more what we wanted from the institutions we were working with, and bringing more process of mediation and education more connected to the architecture as a discipline that can go through different others and bring from different others disciplines a way of working and representing and interacting. And somehow the two of us, we were architects, and the way we were using a methodology on the practice of architecture and on an architecture office, we were using somehow the same when we were doing mediation workshops for institutions, like doing a survey, doing a project in the beginning more in a big scale, then to focus more on the details and on the needs of the institution or from a certain groups. So instead of always putting the young kids playing as architects, that was not what never interested us. We were more into this kind of the bringing to the surface of the paper, or bring to the surface of the land, what was underneath, covered. So we always work on this, that was what is inside, what we are made of, what we have in our minds. And that can also happen on the sites and the place we live in or we walk through. That's why the cartography and the mapping, all these layers that sometimes the architects need to work with, from the isolation to the structure to the inside. All this composition and components were important to us to bring to the archi-education that we start to develop. And so there was different institutions, mainly from the north, but some from Lisbon, who plan with us certain long-term workshops. There were projects that could just have a duration of 3 days or 5 days, but there was others that were long-term workshops, long-term work projects, like to implement a 1-year project with a certain institution. So I'm going to show you some images of projects that we work with other institutions, and from these institutions we also start to have very good connections with people that work there and to develop other things. And then we see each other on these kind of international meetings. But this was a very incredible experience we had with in an entire summer. We work with this very strange house constructed in the north called Rock House. So we pass a lot of time with the kids around the house, inside the house. We met the owner, then we could find one of the constructor, a very old man who used to work with granite, then the carpenter that did the furniture inside. So we start to, with the kids, to define projects and what were the people they wanted to meet, how could we go and do this approach, and how the drawings were important to bring this survey then to the studio or to the museum to work with. And these are moments where we really enjoy to spend some days around and inside the house. We used some techniques to measure, to survey, that are used by other disciplines like archaeology, like bringing fresh plaster and fresh clay to mark the objects that we cannot bring inside or to the workshop and draw attentively. So they were also playing not only by the scale of the site, measuring, but also to collect this information and then transform from negative to positive, from the mark to the mold, and then look again to this kind of details. So we passed a lot of time drawing and looking attentively. And then we invited to go to a car workshop, a car garage, and we went and talked with the people responsible for the garage to give us some old equipment and objects from the car engines and motors. So we brought these again strange objects to start a project from those. So doing this kind of drawings, using vegetable papers, doing more rigorous drawings, look inside, trying to imagine the interior, constructing models was what the process we did. This was another one that was also very important on this idea how to work from something that we don't know, that it's in distance from us, how to represent by a description, how sometimes we can be completely wrong from a description and others more close to it. Probably you know the story about this rhinoceros from Albert, this printing from Albert Dürer from the 1515. This is a rhinoceros that was given to the King of Portugal, Dom Manuel I, on the time of the conquest. And he was kept in Lisbon next to an elephant in a palace. Sometimes they were put it out in a big square near Lisbon that now is transformed. It's a completely different place before the earthquake. And they were shown and exhibited and sometimes put it in a battle. And then the rhinoceros was give back from Portugal to Italy as a present to the Pope. Then there was an earthquake and the boat fall down and the rhinoceros disappear. But during that time of this animal that was in Portugal, a lot of people wrote about this, and Dürer did this printing, first a drawing and then a printing, by a description that it's written here on the top. And it's a description that somehow also talks about like some certain tenderness of the beast, of the animal. So this is the drawing, and from this kind of representing the unknown, we did also a workshop that we brought to a lot of high schools. That was from this idea of representing what we don't know exactly how it is. And it was really nice to be with this kind of teenager boys and girls to understand their bodies, to feel, to touch, and trying to represent how they imagine how they were, their feet. So again, using this kind of different layers for drawing. And the same process somehow was also used to start to understand some objects of I forgot the legend here, of an institution that has a collection of pre-Columbian and African art and Chinese objects. And we wanted to discuss this kind of description they were doing from an image that was given to a colleague and then drawing from the description. And what we start to see was also how people were, or how this group of students were describing these objects, and how they were always inputting some scare, lack of knowledge to these objects. So I start also to think on it, and then we also develop a project with the team from the museum more linked to these kind of things. Well, this is again, well, I'm continuing to show you these images of project that we did, sometimes with colleagues architects, sometimes for architecture students, but always this importance of changing scale, working from model to build it. That it's something that, well, probably, I don't know if it's a problem in Porto school, but we don't construct a lot, we don't essay a lot as construction, so this was quite unusual for the student of architecture. This was also an important project from me and Anna to develop with a team that was from the city center. We were talking, discussion with the young dwellers of of the city, this kind of problems of gentrification, how they were used to see their city, where were the places they knew, what they knew about the name of the streets, how the city was meaning to them, what was missing. And it was an age very nice and important for us to work with, from the 6 and from the 6 years old to 9 years old. So there was still a moment for a lot of desire, dreaming, and we work a lot in families. The other day I met one of the girls. Well, this was a time when it was not so difficult to take pictures, but one of these girls, she's now studying at the school, artistic school, high school, so we were quite happy. But well, I'm just sharing some images of these processes that our methodologies we try to bring from architecture to the mediation project. And so we always do this kind of site survey. We print in plans. We give them time to understand what is a plan when they are exactly in the same place. How they leave small manifests of they could change the seat, what they proposed to abandon buildings. This was nice because with Simon and Renate, we were somehow thinking of the same and discussing how to intervene in the city. Well, we still use a lot of this kind of collage from pictures they take, how they imagine these kind of different layers of buildings, of stories, of time. So it were some exercise they were doing. These kind of things are much more amount of times than normally we pass, and we don't take time to try to see all these layers or other kind of readings from also social representation of the city, who live on the first floor, on the second floor. This was very interesting to go to the backyards of some areas of the city, the hidden, the forgiven, the forgotten, and they became more aware of this place. This is a very nice public primary school that exists in the city center. And this is another somehow partnership we do with Karen Lacroix, that it's an illustration school, but always this kind of approach and essay to be using to measure. If we don't use the numeric scale, we can use the graphic scale, like a rope, to bring different things and to collect different tools and collect different things. How and these kind of mapping that are on the floor that came from these three researchers I mentioned in the beginning of the talk: Elvira, Alberto Carneiro, and Manuel Malpic. And so the third axis of talkie-walkie was to bring possibility the exchanging of knowledge on site. That means that we were very interested on organizing travels, but not anymore only for architects. And then, but from there, we could start to organize guided tours where the knowledge could be bring by someone from the popular knowledge, from the that has the same erudition as the academic knowledge. So we start to organize all over the country some supports of the of the Portuguese Cultural Ministry, some tours that were trying to put together artisans, workers of boats, artisans of olive oil, small companies, and we start to put together engineers with boats builders, and then we were also taking this exchanging of knowledge from different approach, and one more academic, another one more popular, and bring these to performative tours that could be done by different artists, dancers, collective of theaters, group theaters. So we start to organize this kind of performative walks, performative guided tours, where from these survey talks that were shared with the public, but also the references used by the artists then to compose these guided tours. Some of them were working with the community, some others don't. So we were giving some liberty for the artists to do. So in a certain moment, talkie-walkie was not only working, doing programs with 2 architects and a group of other architects interested on our main subjects and programs, but also start to work directly with artists. And that was, I think, a moment that we also understand that things were really different from where we started. And well, this is a moment that we decide that we could open a little bit for discussion and or questions, and to see your faces, or to be open to try to answer to some doubts you can have and share. Till now,
maybe I have a question, or yes, because you mentioned so many methods and so many spots on different places and people and actors, and this program, this walkie-talkie, invites. So I want to say, it looks like there you bring workers, different knowledge together with artists and educators, and I'm always thinking about something like that. What does it mean if the knowledge, in the process of knowledge sharing, if the knowledge which comes up on the discussion of deconstructing representation, if there is something you don't want to hear, or if something happens and it's not the same, it does not say what you want to say, that comes out of your project. Maybe it was a little bit complicated. I wanted to say your methods, all your methods are deconstructing reality or stereotypes, or working with the thing we don't know. And then you bring knowledge together. But what happens if there are many things said which you don't want to hear?
Or to be
did you have such an experience, and what could be the strategies in the field of, or in the field of art education?
Well, maybe the methods are not so different. Probably the way I explain seems that it's an amount of methodology, but I think it's different. It's more an amount of different proposals and invitations and working with different teams. That seems that this is too many things, but as I tried to explain, the methods were more or less the same. Even if we were working directly with an art institutions, if we were working with a primary school, or if we were working outside our region and going with artists to a place that I never visit before. So what we were using was this method of the architecture practice, or the architect practice, that is this survey, this scaleless representation, how we can see from the whole, how can we go to the detail, how we can mention a certain needs and also some obligation given by the, I don't know, the art institution or the public secretary that pays for the project. So we were working as we were doing a build project somehow. And we were listening to different voices and visiting different places to find exactly where to build or where to implement our project. And some of these people, like from the miller to the boat constructor to the woman that used to still use a process with the centuries to dry fish, were people that we were just knowing while we were working on place. And of course, that every time we were implementing this kind of project, we wanted to have, I don't know, the complicity of people from the municipalities or the cultural programmation, or even artists from these places, this region, to help us and to be part of the project, also helping us selecting these people. And of course, we face moments where we knew somehow why this worker was selected than the other, but we were more interested on discuss this process. So normally these are projects that takes like 2 years or even 3 years. So I'm just somehow showing you moments of first meetings and discussions, and then the final object that can be this performative walk. But this survey that I'm somehow repeating, this first contact for us with people that were always there, were somehow, they were revealing things, and they were also, of course, taking problems to the discussion, but we never felt that were moments where we need to filter or to avoid certain discussions. But maybe when I mentioned cartography or mapping, somehow this representation is also faking something real. Sometimes the reality doesn't show exactly. So I don't know if we are always completely honest on what we are showing, but because it took time, were very nice projects in terms of having time to dig, to go through, to knock the door again to that people that on the first time was not very open to the idea of participating. So I think the problem sometimes is how these kind of things can be continued. But that's why for us was very important to work with artists that were from those regions. Leonor Barata, she's a dancer, and she's also linked to theater and to mediation, and she was from that region. So she was always in contact with certain companies of dancing, theater that existed there. So I think we had this possibility of bringing a lot of nice projects, but also to live that practice directly with this kind of group of people. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it answered.
Yeah, of course. Do anyone have questions?
I'd probably like to ask one follow-up question, because you just talked also again about mapping and the connection of mapping to portraying reality, and I was very intrigued when you talked, starting with the Dürer image, on the method of description, because I feel like what mapping is for the architectural discourse, probably describing in a way, is for art education discourses. So when we always work with just trying to describe what we're seeing and what images we're seeing when we're looking at images to get together and then try to deconstruct what kind of gazes are in there and what kind of ideologies reproduced through certain forms of description. And I was wondering how, in your experiences of these projects, this kind of critique of mapping or different strategies to mapping were related to different strategies of describing that probably came up, or how this kind of verbal method of describing and representing so-called reality relates to the discourses on mapping.
Yes, a lot. That was some moments where we felt that the way we describe things that we don't know, and how we represent it, and sometimes how we look to maps with a certain that is such a true representation. Sometimes we also don't believe that this is only a representation and not the representation of the reality. So I think the feeling or the half fake or half true, it's from both sides. So I don't know if the answer was exactly that or to the question, but
yeah, maybe just specifying whether this, because you described different strategies towards mapping and how to remap, or how to use different scales, or how to use bodies for mapping the city streets, and whether any of these strategies were also probably applicable then to the experiments with describing images.
I think maybe we were using different ways of representation, representing what's around us. When it's like a survey from an aerial view, very designed by a computer, is different than these mental maps that were drawing inside, or when we put this kind of tape on the floor, like other artists did, and measuring. And I think we somehow were always questioning those approach. If we were feeling that the group was not into that, maybe we're somehow forcing again to see if it would working, or if we go on other direction. But normally there was different ways of approaching and survey that were changing from the ages of the public, from what we also wanted, or what the participants wanted more. If something was more to be built as this kind of geodesic dome, it was important, some rigorous, to understand the geometry behind Buckminster Fuller, and we were doing this kind of presentation. If we were more into the discussion of the city with young kids, we were more trying to ask them to represent more mental maps. Tell me where your grandmother lives. Is it in the city of Porto? Okay, so maybe I'll need to go to the computer and print the region of the north. No, she's coming from, she's still living in Mozambique. Okay, so let's go and print a new scale. So, but sometimes we also have this information before from the school, or but that was something that was interesting in terms of we also had maps and more information, scale, sometimes more scale, sometimes more layers. That are what is behind the facade, what is the backyard, what is the backyard of the other house, so what is the other side of the street. And so sometimes we work in this kind of mapping from an aerial view, that it's a little bit God view, but then when we start to go deeper, it's not only a matter of scale less, but also to show more or to hide more. But I think this methodology is used on architecture practice and when we are doing projects. But the way we deconstruct that, it's only thanks, I think, from artists, contemporary artists, or from land art movements that were very important for us. So we tried to, to also map ourselves differently for each project.
Maybe because you also have some images and some thoughts for us about or from the project Ping. Yeah, maybe this brings us to the topic of mapping the institution in the city, where you are now and where you are dealing with the question how is the transmission of these thoughts and this mapping and this process of criticizing, the institution and the surrounding. Maybe we have a few insights in that work, and then we can follow up with a discussion and bring these two topics together as a walkie-talkie outside of the institution and your work inside in the institution.
Recently I've been invited, and not the team talkie-walkie was a direct invitation to me for different reasons that it's not now need to bring here, but somehow we needed to hibernate the company of talkie-walkie for sad but also reasons that we can also know as a pandemic, because the institutions that were also working on this project with us also stopped to develop this kind of project, because it was not possible to work with directly with communities, with groups from schools. We decide very recently, because this project we saw with artists in a certain region of the city, of the country, finished recently. We decide to stop with this, to give a post to talkie-walkie company, but also, and I'd like to mention this, Portugal was under a very economical problem, and also related to the culture and how we manage the money in culture. And something that the pandemic brought was that the art educators that were working with different art institutions in the country, some of them public institutions, some other half-private institutions, were freelancers and workers that were only paid by the projects they were integrated, and sometimes they were not only paid by, they were not fairly paid by the project, but only by the hours and times they were dedicated to the project. And some institutions are now facing big problems also in the courtyard from workers of museums that are fighting for their rights. And because talkie-walkie was also part of this project, maybe more stabilized, because we decided to be an agency, but we were not agreeing with that kind of contracting. That was not fair for the art educators, so we also decided to not continue working with institutions that are not correct and fair to the departments of mediation. So recently we decided, but somehow I have this privilege that it's to have the opportunity to working in a municipality art gallery. And when this invitation came, there was no education department. There was already a very interesting public program to a not defined scholar age public, was this kind of public programs that we know from performances, from talks, from concerts, and of course under the main exhibitions that were happening. So when I was invited to get into an institution, life changed dramatically for different reasons, because now I'm representing an institution. So I thought how I could be and continue to be connected to what were my interests and practice and methodology. But somehow it was also interesting to find that other problematics were being discussed, and maybe I was not so into that discussions. I was not so aware. I I thought that I would have everything very clear in my mind, but no, things are much more hidden in the problems and in the institutions. So when this department was created, I worked again with a very nice team that were also created to enlarge the team of the Galeria. Galeria, it's an art gallery dedicated to contemporary art since more or less 2015. And it's located on the top floor of a municipality library, but they had an empty exhibition room, and the contemporary art gallery from the municipality was become more developed since that time. But there was no educational department. So I got in exactly 2 months before the pandemic, who also gave me the opportunity to not be on rush to prepare a program, but to have even more time that sometimes don't exist on institutions to prepare better the entire educational project. So just some images of the place where the gallery is located. It's a garden on the top of a hill of the city of Porto, facing the sea. And it's a garden with a very beautiful view. It has this kind of very modern buildings, a big dome for sports and now for concerts, live concerts, from the 50s, from a very famous modernist architect of the city. And inside of the exhibition hall, on the floor up the library, that it's also a very nice place. There's a main room for exhibitions and a mezzanine, that it's this place here, that it's normally dedicated more to solo exhibitions, more young artists. So I'm showing 2 exhibitions that were quite important for me, although they were opening in between these different quarantines. When I start to think on what were the main axes and subjects to develop an educational department, again, I used the same methodology I was used to, that was start to walk around, walk inside, go to see the streets that have no directly connection to the main ones. I start to go back to a place that I used to go when I was much more smaller. That was this hill that goes to the riverside, that it's made of these orchards and squatted orchards on a green lawn that goes to the river, because it has a water stream, one that passes here, also with mills here. Water mills. So that's a romantic area of the city of Porto that has been now refurbishment and called like that because had been developed during the beginning of 19th century, when also the Romanticism was very important in different areas of culture and economy and industry, and the Porto wine, for example, is an example of this Romanticism. It's called this area around, it's called the Romantic part of the city of Porto. And so I was very interested on work inside and outside. I created one of the axes for programming the educational department. It's an axis called Exodus, from this idea of getting out of this space that it's a garden with walls, with gates. And what we do, to be very synthesized, is we organize tours from the gallery to the outside to visit some alternative art spaces, art galleries, cafes that program discussions, studio artists visits. So it's not more than that. It's an axis that works quite well with schools that are still difficult to work directly with schools, but where teachers can organize with us what different mappings they can do and go and visit these kind of spaces, or we give on the program to the public and people subscribe. So this is very easy. It's not on the research, it's more on the sharing program of the educational departments. And well, I forgot, but then I can explain why it's called ping. And the other two axes, so we define three axes, like three axes define a plan. We were also interested on this idea of the garden, this somehow forgotten process of healing with plants, know more about herbalists, but also to understand what is underneath the land, what is growing up, how we can bring this to our body compositions, and to work with this kind of small different botany worlds. And we create a program called Gynoecium and Stigma from the anatomic side of the plants and the vegetation. Gynoecium, it's the feminine part of the plants, and Androecium, it's the masculine part. But we wanted to not go on this dichotomic representation, and we brought the part of the fecundation of plant that is the stigma, and from that botanic side of the garden, we developed a series of talks underneath this kind of ecofeminism political movements on these botanical speculations, how the artists worked with different disciplines that are connected to botanic. And I will show you some artists that we invited to come and work with us. Uriel Orlo is a Swiss artist, and he's very interested on this tangled relation from the origin of vegetation and species, why they are transported, why they are used to be represented in other countries, were the people behind this kind of transportation and study these plants. He had an work installation that we as a team liked a lot. It was called the Teatro Botânico, and somehow he was questioning this kind of colonial botanic representations, and we invite him to do a long-term workshop where we came to study the site with us. It was also for us the first time we were studying all these surroundings of the Galeria and the gardens, we invited him also to be like a catalyzing different other people to invite them to come to the workshop. So during this long-term workshop that we're still working through 6 months with a group of participants, other specialists are brought to show and to share their knowledge. So a little bit like talkie-walkie was doing, and I had this opportunity to do with Uriel, because he also an artist that works like that. So this is Fernanda Botelho, an incredible herbalist from the south of the country, showing the potentially and the hills and the knowledge from medicine of plants that were used recently from other generation and completely lost, for example, as treatments in Portugal. And she's still doing an important survey on eatable plants, the therapy side of plants. But we also invited an incredible collective of artists called Lendra, that are maybe the only couple I know that are really knowledgeable on foraging, and they are trying to plant an entire edible forest. So they are incredible people, and it was really nice to have the participants and the artists bringing and sharing all this knowledge together. So at this precisely moment, just to tell you how we are developing this project, at this precisely moment, each participant are developing each own project, artistic projects, from what they learn from these different specialists, and will do a small salon of all the works together. That's why the workshop was called by Uriel the Assembleia das Plantas, the plants assembly. So we'll use this summer house to then do an collective exhibition, and the participants are invited and discussing their methodology and process during this time directly with Uriel or with us as a team. And the third axis that we are developed at Ping, it's from a colonial exhibition that took place in those gardens in '34, and these projects came as very important and compulsory matter to study and program. Although I felt that there was very interesting collective of artists and researchers and activists already working on this, but what was easy to reach was more all these kind of documents that existed, but I used to see them on classes, on booksellers. I used to be in contact with them, but I was not so well into this matter. I knew that things were still teaching in the Portuguese schools that should be changed. Words, ways of seeing the world, ways that are still very symbolic to see to explain to young people how Portuguese was an important conqueror of the world, and this of course needs to change. But somehow these elements were bring to the school always to in an allegoric demonstration of this nostalgic idea of Portugal in the entire world. And this was a map that was very common, and it was advertised, used on this colonial exhibition in '34, that says Portugal is not a small country. And for a very nice coincidence, an architect that was from my school of Porto was questioning and somehow subvertising this map, saying Angola, it's not a small country, where he inverted the mapping that was used to show that the old colonies of Portugal, when they were put together over Europe, they would arrive to the evil Russia. And here, what it shows is that Portugal is really a small country, and we need to have all this surface of Portugal to show Angola. And this is a project from 2011. I was far away from imagining that one day I was always, again talking with him to understand better what he was researching and interested on working with. And there was this kind of images. I found an album of photographies from '34 in my family library, and somehow these images were common to me, but I needed to go back to these different layers of times to understand, and I go back to the images I showed to you about the site where Ping is located. That is the dome I just showed it to you. that is built in the 50s over this Crystal Palace from 1865. But in between, in 34, the Crystal Palace was somehow covered, packaged by this Art Deco facade, and it became the Palácio das Colónias, the colonial palaces, to bring to opening the exhibition of 34. And again, when we were looking to this image and to this monument, this monument was also in the city of Porto. It's still shown in the city of Porto, in a very posh area, in a neighborhood where the streets have names of old colonies and old harbors of Portugal or colonial empire, and it marks a roundabout in a very posh area of the city of Porto. And all these monuments were there, and I was not even questioning them, but some collective of artists, some collective of people from different countries that were living in the city of Porto was already start to fighting, questioning, doing small discussions around these monuments, this name of the streets. So it was really important to start to understand the place where we were and why it was already in evolution, and we were somehow starting a department and without being so attentive to these. And then, for example, it was important to talk with different professors of the Fine Arts School and understand that this collective was also doing PhDs in the Fine Arts School. So there were people that were also very impatient to discuss all these. So it was really important for me to take out these lenses that was filtering these things that were coming in to me, but I was looking them in a very pleasant way, far away from the importance of they were bringing to. And this was another document that was the map that was done for the colonial exhibition, where you see around all the companies that paid for this colonial exhibition in 34. And this colonial exhibition was one of the latest in Europe, although there was an important one with big dimension in Brussels, another in Lisbon, who brought people and families from old colonies to be representing how they were not living anymore in different parts of the park. They were representing different colonies of Portugal. So in here you see the Crystal Palace, the monument we were talking about, that is now in another part of the city. So we were also interested out to understand there was no mark of this anymore in the gardens. Some of the public monuments were spread in the city, and they were there, and we as department were not so aware of this. So it was really important even for us inside the institution to start to question. But we also felt that we were not able to do it by ourselves. We invited a collective of curators to do an entire program that finished recently. So the idea is that from this year to the future, we'll work with different people. So we invited 3 curators, Alexandra Balona, Nuno Coelho, and Melissa Rodrigues, to work also intersectionally with the Interstruct Collective. They come from different experience, from activists, from graphic design, literacy, from architecture and body representation. So it was really important to have these different curators debating with us how could we start to plan this axis of from the colonial exhibition. So the tables start to be covered with these documents and objects that were done in the time of 34, and they gave the name the elephant in the Crystal Palace because the icon for the advertising the exhibition was this elephant that was also on the top in the main entrance of the building. So they prepare a very interesting and intense program of debates and talk. I might say that it was completely impossible to work directly with schools, with teachers bringing their students to the talks. They were just coming back from the quarantine. It was in May of last year, but then again things closed once more. So we were almost having a non-scholar public and a scholar public from superior studies that were the same, that were always in this kind of debates. So it was not, we felt that the public that were on these main talks were not so unknown of these matters. But this is to tell you that Interstruct organized this kind of walks, shared a lot of objects, small scale, big scale, and with them we were creating an enormous wall where people were somehow copying these objects, materials, adding information, framing, and somehow deciding what to show from these images that were in albums, that were used in books, and there was a lot of time to discuss these images. And tell you that what was really important from this program was the work that we did directly with the schools. So we could only organize 4 workshops, and we did it more easily than we never thought because we had contact with teachers from our lives and experience and works. So we could call a teacher, please open the door of your school and let us bring these artists to there. And I hope this year we can start to plan and work more directly with the teachers and their classes. So here is Dori Negro, a Brazilian artist linked to performance and dance. And he created a very beautiful workshop from goddess and gods from her grandmother ancestry, and he explained different ways of believing, different ways of faith, and it had a tremendous impact because a lot of young boys and girls from immigrant families were able to talk about the authors their grandparents used to have at home, or why their mothers from Brazil and Angola, for example, were begging to different goddesses that they were not used to see here in the city of Porto. So it was really impactant, this workshop, with a lot of body communication. They create a gift to a goddess they select, and somehow they recreate it. And then what for me was really important in this workshop is that Dori gave the gift to the sea, and then it took and used these pictures of these collective gifts in his work. So working directly with artists that somehow, well, Dori had already important experience on art educators, but it was really important. And this was a moment for me to think that sometimes the art education that is in this mediation line between schools and museums somehow are powerful for young adults that are also the mediators between home and schools. And the more we bring to students in their schools, the more they will become important mediators from what they learn in schools and from what they learn abroad, and bring inside their families problems and discussions also, and beliefs and doubts.
Maybe, sorry?
Yes.
Maybe, maybe I thought this is also the potential of the work of Come and Go to build up continuity for these topics. I just make a small intervention because of time. Maybe we should care about, we have time for discussions and for questions.
It's very nice to see so many faces, and you can also just talk or raise the hand if you have anything to add or to question.
I have one question, Matilde, because on the last project you, or more, also many questions, but you also have to take care about time. But the last project, the third axis you talked about, it was very interesting when we have seen the exhibition in Porto. You also displayed your research on the colonial exhibition, and you researched, displayed your ways how to deal in a critical way with the images. And for me, it was very interesting and new. You said, okay, in Porto, this topic is not so well discussed. Maybe in other countries it's more discussed. But for me, it was very interesting that you had an exhibition where you talked about their own institution and the history of the place of this institution in the fact of thinking about the colonial history. And that's not so often seen in other countries. So maybe you can share your strategies or your experience. How is it possible to intervene in exhibition with this topic as an art educator, with objects, with another story, to bring these topics together on display? It's something, for me, it's something like it's like a layer, many layers, which are not, I think, planned before in the exhibition.
I think was a matter of lucky, and I hope now we are having a new director just arrived this month, and she was also asking me how to tangle all these kind of things. And when we were together last time, I was telling that for a long time I used to work on layers and different images and maps and scales. And now I'm more interested on go deeper on like the roots of the trees that are in the gardens, because somehow they are the only testimonies of what happened on the colonial exhibition that are still there present. So what the roots can tell us in terms of course, a metaphor. So I'm still trying to understand how we can tangle problematics from botanic to colonial perspective, and that on this tangled, I think our new director is interested on tangle these more and more. I don't know if it's possible in an institution to do this. I think we dream sometimes when we are on educational departments to be more in contact with the curators and the artistic directors, and that maybe it's still possible in our institution, because we are at the end 8 people working, even less, on the decisions of doing the program. But what happened, I think it was a matter of luck, because there was this artist called Pedro G. Romero that has now a very big exhibition in Madrid. So it's someone that you can easily look to continue to see more about him. When I saw that I was not sharing anymore the screen, was that I had this image of Pedro G. Romero. And Pedro Romero is an artist that he was the curator and the artist himself in the exhibition, that it's normally was something now more divided, the curators and the artists. And he was just sharing research that he's been doing for the last 20 years that are for the people that don't recognize borders, and in terms of politics, geography, in terms of way to live. And it was very interesting on showing in an exhibition this group of people, from anarchists to refugees to gypsy communities. And when we spent like 1 year working with him on an exhibition, on a pandemic moment where we as a team were not so overloaded to do a lot of workshops and guided tours, we had time to work together with this artist. That was someone always questioning, and every time he does this big exhibition, he tries to anchor this research to the place where he exhibits his research, his archives. So Portugal, in terms of working with the gypsy community on the music, was very interesting for him. The flamenco and the fado, it was very also interesting on understanding better what were the main goals after the revolution in '74 to build communities and housing complex for gypsy communities. And because I was the architect, I did this survey with him all over the country for him so I think it was a matter of luck. And then what happened is that during the quarantine, we had no program to implement, and the budget that gave us some leftovers, and we used to buy an archive of documents that were the ones I show you, plans, albums of photographies, postcards, souvenirs that were not in our department. They didn't belong. So we bought those with the money that was not used to implement programs. And when Pedro Romero came to work to this exhibition, we were also at the same time studying this. So somehow he was sharing his questions, and we were also having a lot of questions. And because he's very knowledgeable, he mentioned a dancer from Ghana, and she's an important dancer on a Belgian company, Inca Ezzy Graves, that she was working on this disappearing act. And when I was explaining that the gardens doesn't have any built reference from what was the colonial exhibition, he started to put everything in contact. So I think he was very interesting to work with, but it was a matter of luck. So he was the one who said, I want to show your archive, and I want to put it here in this place. So I think it happened, but maybe it's important that we can recognize this practice to be more assumed than somehow declare in the future program.
So we have to work on this, on the organization of this kind of luck, the
Yes.
openness, the coming together, to bring the knowledge, the research together with different perspectives to work on these very important topics, to change institutions, maybe.
Matilde, there is a question in the chat from Gabby. She writes, I keep wondering if the representatives of the Portuguese colonies were there as real leaders of the countries, or were they seen as sideshow characters by others?
In the time of the colonial exhibition, that's correct. The representatives of Portuguese colonies were there as real leaders of their countries, or they were seen as sideshow characters by others. No, well, there's not so much information from the process that has been taken over to that colonial exhibition, and that human zoo, that was a name given by a researcher, a Spanish researcher on this kind of ethno and freaks exhibitions. But those groups of natives, somehow we have information that they came from the different regions and put them to be shown disguised to represent the ways of living that they were already not by them collective. But something we know is that groups coming from Islamic religious communities were forced to change their name when they were in the exhibition. So we are still studying a lot of these archives and inviting historians that were on this research. But what we think is that these studies are only done by the Portuguese viewer and European viewer to the otherness, and not the research is now maybe more interesting to do directly with with people that are now in the faculty studying exactly this kind of events. But what we know is that they were forced to change names. It was not correctly the name, the number of people who came for the exhibition in 34 and the ones who came back. They were not paid. People died in both travels. So it was really something that was completely covered by the regime in that time.
So thank you so much that you were with us. Thank you all to the others for the questions. And we wish you a nice evening, and thank you for being here.